At this time, we're going to begin the graveside services here at the cemetery for Mrs. Renee D. Bank. As we begin the services, I would ask if any of you might have a cell phone or any other noise-making device, please turn them off at this time. Officiating the service here today is Rabbi Isaac Sarada from Macomb Solel Lakeside in Highland Park, and the rabbi will begin the service assisting the family in the ancient tradition of Kriya. If I could ask the family members wearing ribbons to stand together at this time.
Death has taken our beloved Renee. Our friends grieve in their darkened world. In silence there's lamentation, in tears there's loneliness. In sorrow, may those who mourn Renee find the presence of loving friends. Heal them, be with them. For Renee's love that united us in life in which death cannot sever. For her companionship that we shared along life's path, and which continues through the tenderness of memory. For the gifts of her heart and mind that brought us joy and happiness and are now a precious remembrance. For all these things and more, we give our thanks. So in this time of grief, listen to the voice of our sacred scriptures. They bring us the ever-new message of God's nearness. They tell us of our kinship with our Creator, in light as in darkness, in joy as in sorrow, in life as in death. In the folder that you got, there are the ancient holy words of Psalm 23. It's probably the most famous poem in the world. It's been translated into every language. It reminds us of a couple of things. One is our traditional belief that the soul is eternal, that it goes on in a dimension that we can't see. And it also reminds us that we all walk through the valley of the shadow of death at times in our lives. It's the price we pay for loving somebody is that we will mourn for them. But the key word in that sentence is through the valley of the shadow. You can't skip it, you can't go around it. But the ancient words remind us that we can get through it, and that from a place of darkness we can find the light again. And so we read these ancient holy words in translation. The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. He maketh me to lie down in green pastures. He leadeth me beside the still waters. He restoreth my soul. He leadeth me in the paths of righteousness for his name's sake. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for thou art with me. Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me. Thou preparest a table before me in the presence of mine enemies. Thou anointest my head with oil, my cup runneth over. Surely goodness and mercy shall follow me all the days of my life, and I will dwell in the house of the Lord forever. We read, too, from the words of Ecclesiastes, a familiar section that reminds us that for everything there's a season, a time for every purpose under heaven, a time to be born and a time to die, a time to plant and a time to uproot what is planted, a time to tear down and a time to build up, a time to weep and a time to laugh, a time to grieve and a time to dance, a time to throw stones and a time to gather them, a time to embrace and a time to refrain from embracing, a time to seek and a time to lose, a time to keep and a time to discard, a time to tear and a time to sow, a time to keep silence and a time to speak. Indeed, this is a time to speak, a time to share memories of Renee. So it's an honor to call first on her sons, First John, to come up and share a few words in her honor and memory.
Despite never breaking 5 feet or 100 pounds, Renee Bank was a dynamo. She was a true Renaissance woman who annihilated the stereotype of the Jewish mother. The enduring visual memory I have of my mom is her big, broad smile, which was disproportionately large compared to her diminutive stature. She smiled easily and had such a pleasant temperament and disposition. Her outlook in life was always positive. I recall her yelling at me only once in my life. She was a great listener and conversationalist who had a sharp wit, lovely sense of humor, and playfulness about her. She could give and take a joke. My mom was a cultured, refined, elegant, highly intelligent, intellectually curious woman, full of poise and grace. She had a highly developed aesthetic sense, which manifested itself in exquisite taste in clothing, art, food, jewelry, and furnishings. Renee wanted the best life had to offer and went after it. She was detail-oriented and fastidious about her dress, her personal appearance, and her surroundings. She took great personal care of herself. The beauty salon visit was every Wednesday, and electrolysis was every Monday afternoon. After her electrolysis appointment, she couldn't be disturbed for the rest of the evening since she'd be sitting on the couch icing her electrolysis sites. She asked that we spread her ashes down Michigan Avenue. Lifelong learning, being erudite, on top of current events, and being culturally sophisticated and aware were all vitally important to Renee. She instilled in Doug and me her love of art, literature, theater, and movies. It was important to her that Doug and I were also culturally sophisticated and aware. She made sure that she watched the national and local news every evening and the Today Show every morning. She was politically astute and discerning. She knew the names of all relevant movies, actors, directors, and Broadway plays. Most of all, she was a voracious reader. My parents' bookshelves were stacked with the classics of post-World War II American literature. Roth, Updike, Heller, Vonnegut, Didion, Nabokov. All these books and authors became so familiar to me that I had skimmed or read most of them by the time I was actually assigned to read them in high school or college. Renee coveted her personal space and time alone. She was great at drawing boundaries in her life and saying no to commitments and obligations so that she would have more time to do the activities she relished: reading, watching TV, doing puzzles, and playing word games. She taught me to love language and wordplay. She was consistently challenging me to broaden my vocabulary. As a child, I have fond memories of doing jigsaw and crossword puzzles with her and playing Scrabble. She would always do the New York Times Sunday crossword, and even in my adult years, she would mail me logic problems to solve and then report back to her. Mom loved to travel the world and gave her love of travel to Doug and me. She traveled in classic Renee Bank fashion, staying at the finest hotels, eating at the best restaurants, and keeping fastidious notes about every place her and Sandy visited. Her friends knew to contact her when they were planning a trip because her notes were more relevant and detailed than any travel guide. Whenever I was visiting a country Mom had been to, she would be the first person I would call to develop my itinerary. And when I returned, she would also be my first call to share my excitement about the places I had visited. As everyone here knows, it takes a special woman to be able to stay married to Sandy Bank for 64 years. My father was loud, aggressive, and domineering. Renee was able to consistently stand up to him, push back, and most of the time educate him on the wisdom of her perspective. She was liberal and socially aware, which usually led to knockdown, drag-out fights with Sandy. Early in the marriage, Sandy was a dogmatic thinker who saw the world in his harsh black and white terms. He would eventually mellow with age, but in his early years, it was difficult for him to countenance other viewpoints. In 1965, Mom convinced him to take the whole family to Winnetka to hear Martin Luther King speak. Initially resistant, he became proud that he went. During the Democratic Convention in 1968, Mom and Dad had an especially vicious fight in the car about the propriety of the Vietnam War, which Sandy defended in an incredibly ironic manner, considering that he was 4F and never served. Mom threatened him that she would move the family to Canada if Doug or I were ever drafted. Renee was a good match for Sandy. She eventually wore him down. In his later years, Sandy would frequently call me with exasperation and say, "I just can't fight with your mother anymore." My mom had an incredibly strong constitution and force of will. She had a high tolerance for pain and would rarely complain about anything. Renee was also a self-taught gourmet cook who exposed Doug and me to the finest restaurants and cooking in Chicago. Doug knew how to order escargot before he hit puberty. It was important to her and Sandy that we had dinner together as a family most every weekday at 6 p.m. Dinner table conversations were lively and spirited. Mom was able to hold her own despite being the only woman in a house full of alpha males. Mom was also the family visionary, courageous enough to push us out of our comfort zones to see what was possible. She had the vision to make my frugal father move from Glencoe Avenue to our house on Forest Avenue, and then had the further vision to convince my father to move out of the house for 18 months to the Americana apartments across from Northbrook Court, while she had the original house torn down and built the magnificent house they currently live in. She decided and oversaw every construction and furnishing detail. Renee knew what she wanted and knew how to execute it, utilizing the most skilled craftsmen in every trade. The home on Forest Avenue is truly her creation. Even though she was the first person in her family to go to college, Mom was born a generation too early. In a subsequent generation, her great organizational capabilities, work ethic, and Spock-like rationality and analytical thinking would have led her to become a lawyer, a C-suite executive, or director of a nonprofit. As it were, she devoted her prodigious mind to running the tightest, most efficient house on the North Shore. There was no drama or mishaps in our lives. Everything consistently went smoothly, on schedule, and according to plan. There were no missed appointments or things breaking down. Renee's preventative maintenance program would make Jack Welch envious. The house was always immaculate and uncluttered. We never ran out of food, supplies, or toiletries. In fact, Renee had a special fondness for paper goods. She was hoarding toilet paper before it became fashionable. There were no plants or pets allowed in her house. The only other living organism Renee would permit in her house was Sandy, and even he was occasionally at risk. When I was a youth, Mom was my confidant and best friend. I could express my feelings to her safely and without judgment. She forever had my back and took care of me. Mom was my staunchest advocate and always had a sympathetic ear. She respected my autonomy and made a conscious effort not to be intrusive into my life. She allowed me to make my own decisions. This continued into my adult years in marriage. She respected the parenting decisions Ellen and I made and didn't criticize them, even if she disagreed with them. When I was an adolescent, Mom was also the buffer between my father and me. I knew that I could safely go to her when I got into trouble, and she would keep the incident or school discipline secret from my father. When I wanted to do things that I knew my father would shoot down immediately, like backpacking through Europe during college or going on Man in His Land, I would go to Mom first, tell her, and she would then work on Sandy, soften him up, and pave the way for me. The last 3 years have been tough on all of us, especially Renee. After Renee had her bowel resectioning surgery in January of 2020, she was never the same. Her cognitive impairment and dementia progressed relentlessly and perniciously, gradually taking away from Renee everything she loved doing: consuming media, reading, using her mind, doing puzzles, and conversing with family and friends. It was certainly not the way she wanted to live, and many times she expressed the desire to be able to close her eyes and not wake up. But she soldiered on because Sandy, Doug, and I wanted her to, and we needed her. We didn't want to lose her, even in her diminished capacity. A special thanks to Mom's caregiver extraordinaire, Cindy Rose Reyes. Cindy has become part of our family. Mere words cannot describe the love, attention, and tenderness with which Cindy has treated Renee. She has made Renee's last year dignified, joyful, and comfortable. Our family is eternally grateful to Cindy and blessed to have her in our lives. In the end, Renee died peacefully at home the way she wanted, surrounded by her loving family. Sandy died 14 months ago, and now Doug and I are orphans. It all happened so quickly. The starkness and brevity of life is terrifying. All the people that were foundational to my life are now gone. I feel a horrible sense of loss, anxiety, and emptiness. I have a foreboding sense of my own mortality. I am the next generation in line. Goodbye, Mom. You are the woman who gave me life. You will always be an integral part of the very essence of my existence, now and forever. I love you and will miss you terribly.
Renee made no secret of her doubts about the existence of God. I think going beyond that to calling herself an atheist the day I met her. And yet the wisdom of our literature was important to her. And so she could ignore the spots in a psalm where it might talk about God and recognize the spots in this psalm where it would talk about making every day count and attaining a heart of wisdom. And so she loved the language of the poetry, even when she didn't agree with what it said. But she found the meaning, the moral, these things. So Psalm 90 tells us, God, you have been our refuge in every generation. Before the mountains came into being, before you brought forth the earth and the world, from eternity to eternity, you are God. You return us to dust. You decree, return you mortals. For in your sight 1,000 years are as yesterday when it is past, or as a watch in the night. You engulf us in sleep. We are like grass that renews itself. At daybreak it flourishes anew. At dusk it withers and dries up. The span of our life is 80 years and 10, or given strength 80 years. But the best of those years have trouble and sorrow. They pass by speedily. We are left in darkness. Teach us, therefore, to number our days, that we may attain a heart of wisdom. Turn to us, O God. Show mercy to your servants. Satisfy us at daybreak with your steadfast love, that we may sing for joy all our days. Let your deeds be seen by your servants, your glory by their children. May your favor, O God, be upon us. Establish the work of our hands, that it may long endure. Doug, come up.
When we told my mother that a rabbi would preside over her service, she said, "Over my dead body," which of course brings us all here today. John covered everything beautifully. If my eulogy seems redundant. It's because Renee lived her life in such a genuine, remarkably consistent way from beginning to end. She never changed. One addendum to John's eulogy, she did that New York Times Sunday crossword puzzle in pen, which she took great pride in. As I said at my dad's all too recent funeral, I'll say it again here. Thanks to Sandy and Renee, I have nothing but fond memories of growing up in what can only be described as idyllic circumstances. I always felt that my mother was a great partner of and a complement to my father. Her yin to his yang. Pop culture versus high culture. Loud and forceful versus reserved and subtle. Larger-than-life personality versus a quiet dignity. Renee was a self-reliant and a fiercely independent woman, and she possessed a keen intellect. Renee was understanding, caring, and compassionate. She was a feminist who carried herself in a manner which earned respect, and she instilled, as John said, a respect for women in John and me. She was extremely well organized, and no detail in any endeavor she was engaged in was ever left to chance. This meant that we took great vacations, where the travel, lodgings, meals, and activities were executed perfectly. I never missed an application deadline, a doctor's appointment, a school activity, a party, or a sporting event, and I was always on time. The running theme is that Renee was a gourmet cook, and she was indeed. The family meals she prepared for us each and every night, just not on special occasions, each and every night were legendary and delicious. The shrimp cocktails, prime steaks, lamb chops, lobster tails, Caesar salads, steamed artichokes were standard fare in our house and set the tone for my young palate, which resonates with me to this day. But it was her penchant for French cuisine, escargot in the shell, French onion soup, vichyssoise, all made from scratch, that made our family dinner so unique and so special. This meant also that for her birthday, each and every year in and year out, we went to Le Francais in Wheeling. That in its time was the finest, if not the finest, French restaurant in the United States. From my earliest years, I was indeed exposed to haute cuisine. In taking me to a restaurant like Le Francais at such a young age is representative how my mother was passionate about exposing John and me to high culture, notwithstanding our young ages. My mother was sophisticated and cosmopolitan and well-traveled. She was a connoisseur of fine foods and wines and a voracious consumer of great literature. As John said, our house was filled with the great works of fiction and all these giant art books. Renee loved art and assembled a comprehensive and exquisite collection of paintings and sculpture for her beautiful home. But more importantly, it was crucial to her that John and I learned, understood, and above all, appreciated all these things. For example, Renee's favorite wine was Pouilly Fumé, which of course every 5-year-old knows is made from the finest Sauvignon Blanc grapes from the Loire Valley. And just a short time ago, when we were celebrating Nancy's birthday in Paris, we ordered a bottle of Pouilly Fumé and made a special toast to Renee, an act I assure you Renee would very much appreciate. My mother was also a devotee of cinema, as John said, and she did not hesitate to take us to the movies regardless of the rating. In retrospect, however, maybe seeing Deliverance when I was 10 years old was not the greatest idea. But nevertheless, among my favorite memories is watching old movies on the TV, usually WGN, with my mom, and sharing her enthusiasm over her favorite films, On the Waterfront, West Side Story, Guys and Dolls, Casablanca, Inherit the Wind, and the two Orson Welles classics, Citizen Kane and The Magnificent Ambersons, which Renee would be quick to tell you, despite the conventional wisdom, that Magnificent Ambersons is the better movie than Citizen Kane. I would never describe my mother as an avid professional sports fan, but nevertheless, when John and I were young, she would attend all the Bulls and Blackhawk games with us at the old Chicago Stadium. And the Super Bowls, provided, of course, that they took place in an acceptable city. Los Angeles, yes. Detroit, no. I have a very distinct memory of sitting next to my mom at Game 7 of the 1971 Stanley Cup Finals. We were in the last row of the lower section with the standing room only fans in the concourse directly behind us. A gentleman was smoking, which was allowed back then, and his ashes kept falling on my shoulder. My mom would very patiently and very attentively wipe the ashes from my shoulder while shooting the man a menacing glare. Classic Renee. Of course, no discussion of Renee would be complete without at least a passing reference to her fastidiousness, and this may be the record for the most times the word fastidious is used in a eulogy. Our house, as John said, was immaculate all the time, with nothing out of place ever. If cleanliness is indeed next to godliness, then Renee is certainly in heaven. My father was very fond of telling the story of the time he got up in the middle of the night to use the washroom. When he returned, the bed was made. Okay. My mother was also a great hostess. She was the quintessential hostess with the mostess, who, when John and I were kids, threw epic parties for her friends. John and I would sit on the upstairs landing, out of sight, and lower a microphone on a long cord attached to an old-fashioned cassette recorder to listen in on the adult conversations, which were barely audible over the clicking of cocktail glasses and the exhales of cigarette smoke. Oh, the memories. After my grandmother became incapacitated, Renee utilized her hosting proficiencies to take over the annual family Thanksgiving and Passover dinners, which, as you would expect, were spectacular in the decor and food preparation, and really became the centerpieces of our family get-togethers. Renee was a great mother, a great aunt, a great-great-aunt, and a devoted grandmother. Anniversaries, birthdays, weddings, and graduations were never missed and always celebrated in high style. I love my mother very much and will miss her deeply.
There's a chapter in the book of Proverbs that seems very appropriate when we think about Renee. It says, "A woman of valor who can find? She is more precious than rubies. Her husband trusted in her, and so he lacked nothing. She did him good all the days of her life. She perceives that her labor is rewarding. Her candle burns on into the night. She reaches out to those in need and extends her hands to the poor. She is clothed in strength and dignity. She faces the future cheerfully. She speaks with wisdom. The law of kindness is on her lips. Her children rise up and bless her. Her husband sang her praises. Many daughters have done valiantly, but you excel them all." It's my honor to ask the grandchildren to come up. Jordan, Kara, and Andrew are here in person. I think Nikki's watching from afar. Please come up.
As you heard today, our grandmother Renee was not a religious woman. For as long as we knew her, though, there was one psalm she would seek out daily. In honor of her, we'd like to read that psalm today. In the criminal justice system, the people are represented by two separate yet equally important groups: the police who investigate the crime and the district attorneys who prosecute the offenders. These are their stories. Renee devoured Law and Order, just as she consumed and mastered all forms of pop culture. My brother and I found home in her encyclopedic understanding of television and movies, and much of Nikki and Kara's childhood bookshelves were adorned with Renee gifts. When Renee was your grandmother, you never had to wait for the paperback to come out. We would constantly exchange banter, phone calls, emails, and letters about the last thing we watched or read or thought of. In Renee, Jordan and I found a kindred spirit. There have been times where in this family, Jordan and I have been accused of, fairly, of speaking quite rapidly, weaving sentences full of metaphor and millennial pop culture references that often left those around us baffled. But never Renee. She had no trouble keeping up with our banter. She would effortlessly sift through all of my sarcasm and double entendres to grasp the real essence of our conversations, adding in her own insights and, if we were lucky, laughing along with us.
One time, we were about 10 references deep into an Aaron Sorkin rabbit hole. From across the table, Renee had been following the entire time, knew exactly which newsroom episode we were talking about, and knew exactly which New York Times piece we were also talking about, detailing the controversy around last night's episode. I think it's safe to say that Jordan and I will miss our secret ally in our world of references and banter.
Renee's interior life emerged in her exterior. The latest TV guide, a relic even when we were young, was never far from the living room table. And in Renee's house, you were always close enough to a television set to throw one of Sandy's tennis balls at it, which we did constantly, to her chagrin. But Grandma never got mad, instead outfitting the house with more useful outlets for our adolescent energy. The basement was a treasure trove of toys perfectly suited for grandchildren. We would race to move small plastic beads across a winding track on her bead maze. We would slam toy trucks into the walls. We would take the plastic pans that adorned the miniature toy kitchen in her basement, and we'd use them to play baseball with the kitchen's fake fruit. We would do all this, of course, while hitting 60 rotations per minute on Sandy's recumbent bike, right next to all of our toys in the basement. Grandma was an alliance of passion and compassion. She spent her days exploring the worlds that brought her the most joy. These worlds were broadcast into her television sets, projected on the big screen, beamed through the web, animated in her mind. But they were also any physical location that contained or could contain her grandchildren. The basement she furnished, the arcades she endured, the all-you-can-eat Brazilian churrascarias we would bring her to. As it did for Grandma Renee, I hope that my love for culture and for people can define me. At the very least, I know she inspired one of the most important decisions of my childhood. When my brother moved out of my room, I got a bunk bed all to myself. I finally had the chance to make the space my own. Asking myself what Renee would do, I asked for the world's smallest portable DVD player, and I mounted it to the bottom of the top of our lower bunk. For the 4 years that I had that player, I only watched one box set of DVDs. Every night, I fell asleep to the soothing patter of Detective Lenny Briscoe and District Attorney Jack McCoy, thinking of Grandma as I did.
Grandma Renee emanated poise and elegance. She was always dressed in a tasteful, crisp outfit, wearing dark red lipstick that I never once saw smudged, and would never leave the house without her big sunglasses and umbrella to prevent even the tiniest ray of sunlight from getting through. Everything had its place in her well-organized household, and don't you dare try to help after one of her impeccable multi-course dinners by loading the dishwasher, because you will invariably do it the wrong way. While Grandma Renee appreciated cleanliness and order, she didn't take herself too seriously. She maintained a good-natured spirit and sense of humor, especially with us grandchildren, grandnieces, and grandnephews. We got a kick out of telling her about the bugs we found in the basement. She hated the thought of any creepy crawly within a 1-mile radius, and she often indulged us when we would rip up little pieces of napkin to place on her perfectly coiffed hairdo, which was often egged on by Grandpa Sandy. Speaking of her signature hairdo, Renee modeled self-care for us. She prioritized making time for herself and her well-being. In addition to her weekly salon appointments, this also meant she spoke up for herself. Renee was outspoken and never hesitant to self-advocate or share her opinion. She didn't say something she didn't mean just because it was what people wanted to hear. She set boundaries in a respectful, firm manner, letting you know when she had reached her capacity for socialization or she did not have interest in doing an activity. Her ability to respectfully set boundaries and take care of herself is a trait that I value and work to uphold through my adult life as well. Grandma Renee loved a mental challenge, a memory from Nikki. When I was about 11 years old, she mailed me a letter neatly typewritten with a brain teaser called The Zebra Puzzle. As an aside, back when Renee still used her typewriter for communication, I rarely remember seeing a cross-out or a strike-through. She carefully chose each word before committing it to ink and paper. The premise goes something like this. There are 5 people who live in 5 different colored houses, and each one has a different pet. The puzzle gives you a few clues, and you have to use this information to deduce who lives in each house and has each pet, particularly the pet zebra. Included in the envelope were individual slips of paper in which Renee had written each characteristic of the puzzle in her neat cursive for me to use as a visual aid if needed. I was so excited to receive the zebra puzzle and show Renee I was up for the challenge. I stayed up late working on it by flashlight long after lights out until I triumphantly called Grandma Renee with the answer. I could feel her beaming through the phone. I tucked the envelope into my desk and would rediscover it several times over the years. Having since forgotten the answer, I would resolve it and get to relish the satisfaction of arriving at the answer yet again. Renee approached much in life as she did with the zebra puzzle, with unimpeachable logic, meticulous attention to detail, and a seemingly limitless intellectual curiosity.
Renee's perceptiveness came out in many different ways. Whether it was how she always knew my dinner order at Prairie Grass, penne pasta, meat sauce, no cheese. How she very quickly sussed out the remote fart sound device that Jordy and I had planted underneath her chair at Passover Seder. But I would say more importantly, she had the uncanny ability to notice when something was amiss, to sense subtle shifts in my emotions. When I was younger, she knew before I did when Jordy had pushed one too many buttons and would often step in to diffuse. She was keenly aware of any stressors I had from school or from life and always offered her help and guidance. And of course, it was Renee who had noticed my absence that one time that all the cousins ran upstairs for ice cream while I stayed behind and cleaned up our board game. I will always cherish the moments when she reminded me I wasn't alone, and it was through those moments like those that her love and her compassion truly shined through.
Grandma Renee was always interested in hearing about our lives as soon as we were old enough to speak. She never altered her voice into the high-pitched coo adults so often use with children, and she certainly didn't simplify her vocabulary when talking to us. She talked to us as if we too were adults, which made us feel important and that we had something worth saying, even if it was just a 5-sentence report on a learn-to-read book. If Grandma were listening today, we know she would come to us afterwards and celebrate our thoughts, our presentation, everything about who we are, even if she might have bristled that we talked about her hair, her scale, and the bugs in her basement. We will remember Grandma for her passions and curiosity, her perceptiveness and care. It was an honor to spend your final days with you and to be able to give you the care and attention that you always showered on us. Grandma, we love you. We miss you.
I met Renee and Sandy almost exactly 25 years ago when I came to Highland Park in the summer of 1998, and we set up a series of coffee and dessert evenings all around town so that I could meet all of the members of the congregation. And Sandy and Renee hosted one of those in their house. And Renee and I became fast friends. We bonded over, this was a time for me to tell something of my history and biography. And she heard that before I went to rabbinic school, that I was a film studies major at the University of Wisconsin. And so we immediately could have a conversation about how the French film director Jean Renoir influenced Citizen Kane and the Magnificent Ambersons that you mentioned before. So I count myself lucky to have known Renee for so long and to be named as perhaps the only rabbi she would allow to officiate at something like this. We have gathered here to honor her memory. You all knew her. And perhaps you learned something more from hearing her children and grandchildren speak today. Renee was born on May 18th, 1934, Long after all the other memories faded in her life, she could still remember her birthday was May 18th. Psalm 90, which we read earlier, reminds us that a full life is 60 years or given strength 80 years. Renee beat that by nearly a decade. And that psalm also reminds us to make our days count, to attain a heart of wisdom. And these are the things that Renee certainly did throughout her life. She grew up in Rogers Park on Farwell. Her parents, Reuben and Mitzi, were first-generation Americans. In fact, her dad, Reuben, was the first of his siblings to be born in America. Reuben was one of 9 children, so Renee grew up in a really big family of aunts, uncles, and cousins. Renee learned the importance of family, and that never left her. Renee went to Eugene Fields Elementary School and Sullivan High School. She really enjoyed Sullivan High School reunions. Renee was the first of her family to go to college. She studied at the University of Illinois in Champaign, and after graduation went to work in advertising in Chicago. She hadn't been out of college long when she went on that fateful double date. Her friend's date was a guy named Sandy Bank. Pretty soon it became apparent that he was the guy for her. Renee was 23 when she and Sandy got married at the Blackstone Hotel. It was the beginning of 64 years of marriage. Together, Renee and Sandy raised their 2 boys to be good men. The family moved to Highland Park, and Sandy and Renee lived in their house until the very end, which was their wish to never have to leave it. You heard how Renee rebuilt that house from the foundation up. I remember visiting it. Renee loved the kitchen and dining room. She told me then, and I don't think she was kidding, it was big enough that the whole family could come for a meal, but there was no room for anyone to stay over. She told me that with this glint in her eye and that smile that you talked about. That was exactly the way Renee wanted it. She loved to host parties and then send everyone on their way. Besides that coffee and dessert evening, Renee and Sandy even hosted a dinner for members of the congregation early in my time in Highland Park. Renee and Sandy joined Lakeside Congregation, which is now Macomb Solel Lakeside, to see to it that their boys got a Jewish education. And then they stayed members and stayed involved for more than half a century. It's a pretty long run at a synagogue for someone who called herself an atheist. Renee used to come to services pretty regularly at the start. In part, it was to support Sandy, who had a growing sense of connection to God. I think she also wanted to see me and get to know me and hear a sermon and perhaps whatever reference to the latest movies I might make in it. Perhaps she was even planning for this moment, making sure that I knew who she was, the kind of things she would want said. Because Renee had a deep connection to her Judaism. It wasn't about God for her. It was about family and community. Whatever there was in Judaism that drew family together, whatever culture there was that made people feel like kindred spirits, for that, Renee was in. She came to services now and then, but she never missed a cocktail party when we had one. And when she was in the building, she took delight in seeing the next generations become leaders of the synagogue. She loved to see children growing and learning. Over the years, Renee and I had a few conversations about theism. I remember distinctly when she first made it clear to me that she didn't believe in God. We had already become friendly. I'd gotten to know her sense of humor, although I think it may have only been the second time I saw her. And I said, after she told me she didn't believe in God, I said, "What difference do you think it makes to God?" And she laughed. We got to a deeper place. In some sense, the idea of God, not necessarily the being of God, is important. It reminds us that the whole world doesn't revolve around us. It's a lesson in humility. And that was something Renee could relate to. It is not all about us, except in the sense that what we do matters. With our lives, we give life. We are the bridge from generation to generation, and with our love and concern, we build what comes after us. Renee was a builder. She built that house. She built her family. She built up her friends and community. In the end, I think Renee was not a theist in the same way that I've heard the Dalai Lama say that he is not a theist. I agree wholeheartedly. The God that Renee did not believe in is a God that I don't believe in either. She properly rejected the biblical idea of God, an old man who sits in the clouds and hurls down lightning bolts to strike down evildoers every now and then. Renee lived in the real world. She saw that all too often the wicked prosper and the wise go hungry. She didn't see a benevolent God, and instead understood that human beings need to do the work to make the world better. Depending on God to save us seemed futile to her. In fact, I think she was very much in tune with Jewish philosophy and theology that sees the importance of all of us, the importance that each human being, that each human action means in the world. That is what Renee tried to do every day of her life. Instead of depending on God, Renee took a harder route. Without God, it became imperative for her to make a difference, and she did. She made a difference in the lives of her sons and her grandchildren. She made a difference in her bigger family. She made a difference in our community. She made a difference in my life, too. Renee was the definition of the idea that good things come in small packages. She was small but mighty. She made those days count, and she truly achieved a heart of wisdom. These last years have been difficult, taking away her memory, her wit, even her ability to care for herself. Nevertheless, it's always hard to lose someone we love. But there is some comfort in knowing that her spirit has been set free from the body that became her prison. I don't think that Renee really believed in an afterlife. But as we talked about it over the years, she certainly believed in the interconnectedness of all things. And she accepted that with death we may just change our state of being. We talked about modern physics and the idea of dimensions that we cannot see or prove. It is possible that death is a simple move from this dimension to another. From flesh and blood, we become spirit and memory. Renee did believe in living on in the minds of those who loved her. She is with us even now, and will always be a part of each and every one of you. You can hear her voice in your mind. You can see her smile. You can feel her love. In this way, Renee lives on in us and in eternity. Can you hear that song? Jewish tradition teaches us about two kinds of immortality. The immortality of the spirit that goes back to our Creator, and the immortality that we bestow on those whom we love by remembering them and telling their stories and passing them on as we have done today. I ask you to stand for a moment as we say the ancient prayer that reminds us of the traditional idea of eternity and also of our commitment to those whom we love. El Malei Rachamim Shochem Bamramim Hamtzei Menucha Nechona Tachat Kanfei Ashchina Vim Kedoshim Uteharim Kezohar Harakia Mazhirim Et Nishmata Shehalcha Le'olama Ba'al Harachamim Yastireya Beseter Kanfav Le'olamim Vayitzror Bitzror Chachayim Et Nishmata Adonai Hu Nechalata V'tanuach B'shalom Al Mishkava V'nomar Amen. Eternal Spirit of the universe, grant perfect rest in your sheltering presence to our dear Renee, who has entered eternity. Let her find refuge in the shadow of your wings. Let her soul be bound up in the bond of everlasting life. May she rest in peace. Let us say, Amen. There is one more prayer, which is the Kaddish Yatom, the mourner's Kaddish, the orphan's Kaddish. It would more properly be translated. It's a prayer of praise But more importantly, it's a prayer of blessing. At moments like this, we give thanks. We give thanks for someone like Renee, who made such a difference in her life. We say these ancient holy words. I invite you to join me or simply say Amen. Yitgadal v'yitgadash shemei Rabbah v'yalma divrach hirutei v'yamlich malchutei v'chaye echon v'yom echon uv'chaye dechol Beit Yisrael ba'agalau v'zman kariv imru Amen. Yehei shmei Rabbah mevarach le'alama olmei almaya v'yitbarach v'yishtabach v'yitpa'ar v'yitramam v'yitnaseh Vitadar, Vitare, Vitaral, Shmei, Kudisha, Brichu, Vayolrom min kol birchata v'shirata, Tushbechata v'nehemata, Damiran bi'alma v'imru, Amen. Yehei Shlomo Rabba min Shemaya, V'hayim aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Osei Shalom b'imromav, Huya asei Shalom, aleinu v'al kol Yisrael v'imru, Amen. Can be seated for a moment while the gentlemen from the cemetery complete the interral. This is a little bit of earth from the Mount of Olives in Jerusalem. It's a custom to place it into the grave, a symbol of the connectedness of the Jewish people all around the world. I actually thought about putting it inside the vault, but I didn't think Renee would like that, so I decided to leave it and put it on top. Thanks, Doug. Our service here is concluded, but it's a tradition to participate in the burial of those we love. So those who would like to, I invite you to come forward and put some earth into the grave. If, however, that's not part of your tradition and you don't want to participate, you may return to your cars.
One brief announcement as people participate in the burial itself. I want to please make sure you take note on the inside portion of the funeral service folder. The family has asked that memorial contributions be directed to the Chicago Hearing Society. If you don't have a service folder, they are available. I'd also like to let you all know that are in attendance, you're welcome to go back to the home immediately following the interment service today. Thank you.
You guys were always with you really get to know relationships. That's nice. You have the books. I'm Keith Burke. We've met the movies and sorry, dear.
Finish the movies and then let's how's your blood? How's your blood?
She says when she's traveling, she's in Ireland. Whenever she's dinner with parents.
Andy.
So, you know, these
kind of crowded. Steve was probably the cause of why that John got yelled at. Not confirmed, but it might have You know the smooth overroll. Wait.
seven dad. Thankfully they're still around, but they're not inside anymore. They've shrunk as I have. I think so, do it. So. Special Recreation Association, which is a fantastic document. Like I said, we all have a
Anyone else wishing to participate, please step forward. This concludes the service here at the cemetery. Again, the family invites you to join them immediately at 1610 Forest Avenue in Highland Park.
Yeah.